Welcome to Armpit Intellectuals. I'm Zara.
And I'm Bilal. We are the podcast that stays in friction, the place where high-level theory rubs against the sweaty, uncomfortable reality of being from a post-colonial state that's still trying to manage your body like a lying atom in an IMF structural adjustment program.
Today, we are going deep into the dirt. We're talking about the most literal zero point of any civilization, the seed. But because we are armpit intellectuals, we aren't here for a lifestyle chat about urban gardening or organic aesthetics. We are talking about biopolitics, eco-feminism, and why your farm-to-table brunch is actually a crime scene.
It's funny because when you first told me we were doing an episode on seeds, I thought, have we finally broken? Are we doing a lifestyle pivot? Should I start wearing linen and talking about my compost? But then I started reading Vandana Shiva and Silvia Federici. And I realized the landscape isn't nature, it's an occupied territory.
It really is. We are talking about the second colonization. If the first colonization was the British East India Company stealing the land and the labor through what Ranajit Guha calls dominance without hegemony, then the second one is the global north stealing the biological code of the land. This is what Arturo Escobar calls the encounter with development, where the global south is discovered as a problem that only Western capital can solve. It's moving from I own your farm to I own the very concept of life.
Right. It's not just land grabbing anymore, it's life grabbing. We are shifting from the colonial management of territories to the neoliberal management of DNA. Let's start with the big lie we were all fed in our O-level Pakistan studies or social studies classes. The Green Revolution of the 60s is treated like a secular miracle. The narrative pushed by the Rockefeller and Ford foundations is always, we were backward, we were Malthusian, meaning we were going to breed ourselves into a famine. And then the West, specifically the American scientist Norman Borlaug, arrived with high-yield seals and chemicals to save us from our own third world incompetence.
It's the white savior narrative applied to biology, and it's a total scam. Vandana Shiva, who, let's remember, is a physicist by training, shatters this in her book, The Violence of the Green Revolution. She calls it a monoculture of the mind. She argues the Green Revolution didn't bring more food. It brought a specific kind of violence that replaced indigenous biodiversity with standardized, high-maintenance crops.
Violence feels like a strong word for wheat. Most people see a golden field in Punjab and think prosperity.
Is it? Think about what those chemicals actually are. As historians like Edmund Russell have pointed out, the pesticides and fertilizers weren't invented by humanitarian scientists. They were the leftovers of World War II chemical weaponry. We took the chemicals meant to kill people in trenches, ammonium nitrate and organophosphates, and we started spraying them on the plains of Punjab and Sindh. Shiva says we moved from a peace with the earth to a literal war against the soil.
And like any war, you need to erase the local resistance. In this case, the resistance was 10,000 years of indigenous knowledge held by South Asian women. Before this revolution, farming was a circular communal process. You saved your seeds, you traded them, you were the master of your own survival. The Green Revolution turned the farmer into a consumer, a junkie hooked to a corporate drip of urea and pesticides. Corporate IV drip of urea and pesticides. Let's move from the 1960s into the present, or rather, let's talk about how the 60s never actually ended. In 2022, Pakistan didn't just have a bad monsoon. 1/3 of the country went underwater. 33 million people were displaced. We are talking about an area the size of the United Kingdom just submerged.
And the language used to describe it was fascinatingly sterile. The state and the international NGOs called it a climate catastrophe, which, okay, fine. The melting glaciers and the monsoon on steroids are real. But that's a convenient way to point at the sky and say, God did this, or the North did this, while ignoring the fact that we have spent 60 years preparing for our land to fail.
You're talking about the infrastructure of the Green Revolution?
Exactly. This is biopolitics in the mud. This is what Akili Membe calls necropolitics. The power to dictate who may live and who must die. When we adopted the Green Revolution, we didn't just change the seeds, we changed the hydrology of the entire Indus Basin. We built a massive centralized system of dams, barrages, and embankments designed to feed a monoculture.
Right, because these diva seeds require precise controlled amounts of water. You can't just let the Indus be a river. You have to turn it into a plumbing system.
And in doing so, we destroyed the commons of the floodplain. For centuries, the Indus was a pulsing river. It would flood, and that flood was a gift. It brought silts, it recharged the groundwater, it was a circular process. But the Green Revolution logic says floods are a waste of water. We must enclosure the river.
So when the 2022 rains hit, the river hit the embankments, it turned the province of Sindh into a sterile.
And look at what died. It wasn't just people, it was the entire biological archives of the region. We lost millions of acres of crops. And because we are now dependent on corporate seeds, the farmers couldn't even save themselves. If you lose your high-yield crop to a flood, you can't just replant the silt. You have to go back to the corporation, the very people who sold you the system that failed you, and ask for a loan to buy more seeds.
It's a perfect circle of exploitation. The monoculture of the mind creates a monoculture of the land, which makes the land fragile. When the land breaks, the state uses the crisis to further entrench the corporate system. This is what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, but with a South Asian armpit flavor.
And let's be real about who drowned. It wasn't the people in the enclosed housing societies in Lahore or Karachi or Mumbai or Dhaka. It was the subaltern. It was the people who Edward Said might say have no permission to narrate their own tragedy. They were left in the mud because in the biopolitical calculus of the Pakistani state, their lives are statistically insignificant compared to the export value of a cotton crop.
It's the ultimate armpit irony. We are a country defined by a river. Yet we have spent 60 years treating that river as an enemy to be conquered. We are submerged in water, but we are dying of thirst for sovereignty.
We turned a living ecosystem into a factory floor. And in 2022, the factory floor collapsed.
This is where we begin the heavy intellectual artillery. Silvia Federici. For the listeners who haven't read Taliban and the Witch, it's basically the black box. Recording of how capitalism was built on the broken backs and burned bodies of women.
Federici looks at the enclosure of the commons in 16th century Europe. Before capitalism, you had the commons. People shared the land. But for capitalism to work, the state had to enclose that land, fence it off and say, this is mine and you have to work for me to survive on it. This is what Marx called primitive accumulation, but Federici adds the gendered lens.
And if you can't hunt or grow your own food, you become a wage slave. But Federici's genius is showing that there was a second enclosure, the enclosure of the female body.
The great witch hunts weren't just religious hysteria or men being mean. They were a systematic state project to destroy women's autonomy. The witch was the woman who knew about the herbs, birth control, and communal healing. She was a walking, talking commons, and the state had to break her to turn women into machines for the production of workers.
So applying that to a South Asian context, the revolution was just a modern high-tech witch hunt. It devalued the grandmother in the village. She was the original seed keeper. She was the librarian of her biodiversity. The expert in the lab coat is just the modern inquisitor telling her that her 5,000 years of knowledge is unscientific because it doesn't have a corporate patent on it. Let's pivot to the resistance, because if the 2022 floods were the autopsy of a failing system, the Indian farmers' protests were the uprising of the body itself. For over a year, hundreds of thousands of farmers, mostly from Punjab and Haryana, camped at the borders of Delhi. And I don't mean they just stood there with signs. They built cities.
They built a counter-hegemony. This is the most sophisticated labor movement of our generation, and it was a direct response to the state's attempt to finalize the Enclosure. The Indian government tried to pass 3 laws that would have effectively handed over the food supply, the procurement and pricing to corporate giants like Adani and Ambani.
It was the Amazonification of the field. The state was basically saying, the market will decide if you get to eat.
And the farmers' response was a masterclass in what James C. Scott calls the moral economy of the peasant. They didn't just argue about policy, they occupied space. They took the national highway, the literal artery of the state's commerce, and they deprivatized it. They turned it into a common.
I remember seeing the footage. They had libraries on the highway. They had foot massagers for the elders. They had communal kitchens, langars, that fed not just the protesters but the local poor and even the police who were sent to beat them.
And that is the ultimate armpit intellectual move. To feed the hand that strikes you is to demonstrate that you are the one who holds the power of life. This is a reversal of biopower. The state uses necropolitics, the threat of death, the tear gas, the drones, the barricades, to control the population. But the farmers responded with bioresistance. They said, we are the source of life, aka the seed, and we will sustain ourselves and you while we refuse your enclosure.
And we have to talk about the gender dimension here. For a long time, the image of South Asian farmer in the media was always a man. But during these protests, the witches of Federici's theory took center stage. Thousands of women, grandmothers and daughters, were on the front lines. They weren't just supporting the war, they were asserting their own relationship to the land.
Proclaiming their role as traditional sea keepers. Vandana Shiva points out that women are the primary experts in biodiversity. When the state tries to standardize the farm, it's a direct attack on female labor and female knowledge. By standing on that highway, those women were saying our knowledge is a folk myth. It is the only thing that really works when your corporate models fail.
The state's reaction was telling. They used the same tactics the British used. Sedition charges, labeling them international, cutting off their water and internet. It was a digital enclosure. They tried to fence out the farmers from the rest of the world's sympathy.
But they failed because the farmers understood the materiality of the struggle. You can cut the internet, but you can't download it to Paki. They held the 0 point. They understood that in the final calculation, the person who controls the seed and the soil has more power than the person who controls the algorithm.
It was a victory of the subaltern. As Ranaji Guha would say, It was a moment where the politics of the people overrode the politics of the elite. They forced a strongman government to retreat. They proved that the monoculture of the mind hasn't totally won. There are still patches of wild indigenous resistance that the state's chemicals can't kill.
They were the weeds that broke the concrete of the highway, and that is why they are so dangerous to the state. They provided a roadmap for how to survive the second colonization.
We have talked about the floods and the highways, but now we need to talk about the land. We need to talk about the Terminator seed. It sounds like a bad 80s action movie, something Arnold, I'm not going to say his last name, would fight. But in the world of agrotech, it is the ultimate expression of corporate patriarchy.
The technical term is GURTs, 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 Genetic User Restriction Technology. Where Terminator seeds stuck because it's honest. These are seeds that have been genetically modified to be sterile in the second generation. You plant them, you harvest a crop, but the seeds from the harvest, they're dead. They will not germinate.
Think about the ontological horror of that for a second. For 10,000 years, the very definition of life was its ability to reproduce itself, to be a seed meant to be a carrier of the future. But the Terminator logic strips the seed of its future. It turns the seed into a disposable commodity.
This is the peak of what Vandana Shiva calls biopiracy. Corporations take a seed that was developed over millennia by communal subaltern labor, the commons, and they add a genetic off-switch. They then patent that off-switch and claim they created the seed. It's like stealing a car, changing the spark plugs, and then claiming you invented the internal combustion engine.
And the economic implication is a literal debt trap. Traditionally, the farmer's zero point was the seed bag in their shed. If they had a bad year, they at least had the seeds for the next one. But with the Terminator seed, the independence is enclosed. We are forced into a subscription model for survival. Every single year, you have to go back to the corporation Monsanto, Syngenta, Bayer to renew your license to grow food.
This is biopower at its most clinical. As Foucault would argue, the state and the corporation have moved from deduction, taking a portion of your harvest, to the administration of life itself. By making the seed sterile, they make the farmer's life dependent on the global market. This is why we see the 300,000 farmer suicides in India. When the diva seed fails because of a heat wave or a flood, the farmer isn't just broke, they are biologically bankrupt. They have no commons to fall back on.
And in Pakistan, the situation is even more opaque. We don't even have the forensic data points for these suicides because our state would rather pretend they don't exist. We are in a state of internal exile. Our farmers are working on land their ancestors tilled for centuries, but they are technically trespassing on the intellectual property of a corporation based in St. Louis or Basel.
It's a form of alienation that even Marx couldn't have fully imagined. The farmer is alienated not just from the product of their labor, but from the reproductive capacity of the earth itself. The monoculture of the mind has finally reached the cellular level.
And for our listeners sitting in cities, don't think your enclosure is any less severe. We have enclosed our own imagination. We think progress means another mall built on a red pond. We've been monocultured to believe that there is only one way to be successful, one way to be modern.
And we're fucking tired because we are living in a psychological monoculture. We're trying to survive on Terminator ideas. Ideas that don't reproduce, ideas that don't connect us to our history or our soil. We've become internal exiles in our own culture, using the master's language to describe pain that the master's system created.
So where is the exit? If the state has enclosed the soil and the mind, where is the rebellion?
It's the wheat. I love I love this idea from Shiva. A weed is just a plant that grows where it wasn't invited. Like think about when you see a weed growing out of concrete, right? It's resilient. It's a plant that refuses the fence. It's an authorized life form.
So be a weed, save the seed.
Smoke weed too. Save the It's up to you, obviously, it's free choice. Save the stories the state wants to delete. Support the farmers who are fighting for their sovereignty. That's what I wanted to say. Because the sovereignty is the only thing standing between us and a world where we have to pay a subscription fee just to breathe.
Next time, we're going inside the house. We're talking about servant culture. If the enclosure happened in the fields, how does it live in our kitchens? We'll be looking at James Baldwin and the intimacy of the subaltern in the South Asian.
Stay sweaty, stay intellectual, and see you at the arc.